En este hermoso, emblemático e histórico recinto, el Alcázar del Castillo de Chapultepec. Y no menos importante, estar reunidos también por motivo del cuarto Foro Nacional Sumemos, Causas por la Seguridad, Ciudadanos más Policías. Es un gusto, igualmente, que nos acompañen miembros de distintas corporaciones, tanto a nivel estatal como federal. Bienvenidos, este evento es de ustedes y para ustedes. Y bueno, sin más preámbulo, a nombre de Causa en Común, sean todas y todos bienvenidos esta mañana. Vamos a retomar y a continuar con las actividades, con la presentación de la siguiente conferencia magistral, a cargo de Eduardo Diaz, Civilian Oversight. Discutíamos el significado en español y lo más cercano sería la supervisión civil sobre temas de seguridad pública. Ahora me permito presentar a Eduardo Diaz. Es miembro cercano de la Sociedad Religiosa de los Quakers, ha colaborado de manera cercana en diversos rubros con organizaciones con influencia de este tipo, es fundador y líder facilitador de la ABP, Alternatives to Violence Project, proyecto de alternativas contra la violencia, en la sección de Miami. Actualmente es parte del comité ejecutivo de NACOLE y es el autor de libros como Police Oversight y Police Community Relations. El significado de NACOLE es National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. Decíamos también, el significado sería la Asociación Nacional de Supervisión Civil sobre Seguridad Pública. Pues buenos días y bienvenido, Eduardo. Adelante.
Buenos días. Un placer estar aquí con ustedes. Voy a pedir disculpas porque la mayoría de la presentación va a ser en inglés y le tengo que explicar el por qué. Yo soy inmigrante y emigré de Cuba de niño a los 5 años a los Estados Unidos, así que estudié desde el kindergarten hasta la escuela postgraduada, todo en inglés. Así que el idioma que domino mejor es el inglés y por eso en la presentación se lo haga principalmente en inglés. Pero las preguntas y las respuestas lo vamos a hacer en español. ¿Okay? Así que, como ven, el título es 30 Principles of Community Oversight of Law Enforcement. When I started to write the presentation, I only came up with 20 principles, but then as I worked harder, I realized that there's much more to what we're talking about than just 20 principles. I want to tell you that I'm here representing the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, which in the United States is the one national organization that brings together everybody that's involved in civilian oversight of law enforcement. That organization was founded in 1995, and it was a son or a daughter of an international association called IACOL, International Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, which was founded 5 years before. But what I have to tell you is that there has been no international association that has survived. IACOL disappeared, but its 2 children, NACOLE in the United States and CACOL in Canada, the Canadian Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, they continue. And so I want you to know that there's some history about international efforts in civilian oversight, but we have to create a new one. I was on the board of IACOL, of the first one that died. And I was on the steering committee of the second one that died. It was called the International Network of Independent Oversight of Policing. Doesn't exist anymore. Only in history. But that doesn't mean that this work isn't international. The work isn't international. Tenemos una causa en común, not just in Mexico, but in Australia, in Nueva Zelanda, in Ireland, in all the world, okay? We have a lot of things in common. Can you see the next slide, please? The slide shows that where our last national conference was held, which was in California. This was the largest conference that we've had, and we had almost 500 people at this conference. And part of the reason that the numbers are growing is because of so many incidents in the United States of police officers being engaging primarily poor and minority communities in ways that results in obvious violence. And so obviously there's a lot of work that we need to do in the United States. I don't want anyone here to get the impression that we have in the United States arrived at where we need to be. We are in process. Next slide, please. The next conference is going to be in Nuevo Mexico, in Albuquerque, in September of next year. It's not too far away from Mexico, so maybe some of you will consider participating. Next September. In this slide, you see the website for our national association. I would encourage you very much to go on that website so that you can see what's happening. And if you go on that website, you can become a member of the NACOLE listserv, which is a way of by email receiving information about what's happening in civilian oversight of law enforcement throughout the country. And it's free. Next slide, please. There are many, many reasons. Hay muchas razones porque debemos tener supervisión de agencias civiles de la policía. It helps protect human rights. It increases accountability. It helps manage risk. In the United States, we have a lot of lawsuits associated with excessive use of force by police officers. We can reduce that risk if we have better oversight. And one of the principal reasons is that it builds bridges between the citizenry and those with the authority to enforce the laws. Crea puentes entre los ciudadanos y los del gobierno y oficialistas. Next slide, please. As I explained to you, I'm an immigrant. I immigrated to the United States in 1956 as a 5-year-old. I worked for Miami-Dade County for almost 30 years. 13 of those years, I was executive director of the independent review panel of Miami-Dade County. El panel independiente de revisión. ¿De revisión de qué? De revisión de la policía. Okay. Y en los años 95-96 me incorporé al National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement y tuve la oportunidad de ser presidente de esa asociación. Así que soy uno de los ancianos en el campo en los Estados Unidos. Y por eso me invitaron a hablar con ustedes. Bueno, lo más importante es, bueno, quiero decir que estudié en Miami para el high school, en North Carolina para la universidad, y terminé el doctorado en 1979 en Ohio State University. Así que he vivido en varias distintas partes del país, de los Estados Unidos, y las cosas son diferentes. Una hija nacida en Alabama, una hija nacida en Ohio y la otra nacida en la Florida. 3 gobiernos distintos, 3 ambientes policiales distintos. Las leyes estatales hay que entenderlas porque una cosa que es delito en un estado no es delito en otro. También lo más importante para mí es el futuro. Y por eso que le digo que tengo 7 nietos. Y para mí lo que me inspira más que cualquier otra cosa es el futuro. Y tengo un 8º ahora que viene, está en camino. So the future is what's important to me. And part of the reason I'm here is because I want to share the hope that I have for the future. Yo quiero compartir la esperanza que yo tengo para el futuro. Porque tenemos que reconocer, we have to realize that civilian oversight of law enforcement is relatively new. It hasn't been around for a very long period of time. As a matter of fact, if you look at the history of policing, the history of policing is relatively new as well. Okay? And policing has made tremendous strides in the last 20 to 30 years. But there's more to do. And one of the things that we in civilian oversight of law enforcement are interested in we're interested in making the police better. For who? Who does the police work for? ¿Para quién trabaja la policía? Para la comunidad, para el ciudadano. ¿Okay? Entonces, parte de lo que tenemos que hacer es crear puentes entre los ciudadanos y la policía para que el ciudadano sea parte de la seguridad. No solamente darle esa tarea a unos que usan uniforme. Todos tenemos una responsabilidad para nuestra seguridad, de nuestra comunidad. Ok, y lo que quieren reírse un poco, the slide also has a reference to a little video that you can look on YouTube, and I put it on there because I do want you to see that that my life is dedicated to the future. And these slides are available to you. All you have to do is ask me by an email, and I'll be happy to send it to you. The presentation has links to the national and international associations that you might find of interest. Aquí en este slide también está the website of CACO, the Canadian Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. No, that's on the next slide, I'm sorry. Okay, aquí abajo ve la website de CACO. Yo quiero que ustedes conozcan que los canadienses tienen supervisión civil del policía a todos niveles. There is civilian oversight of law enforcement at the national level, at the provincial level, and every police officer in Canada, even at the municipal level, is subject to accountability by a mechanism that was set up to have civilian oversight of law enforcement. The models are a little different in each of the provinces, okay? But I don't want you to think that civilian oversight is just a U.S. thing. I want you to make sure that you look at civilian oversight around the world. My experience is with the U.S., but I have my heart is international. So that's part of the reason I was involved with all these international organizations. The other thing that this slide shows you is that when I talk to the police in the United States, very few of them are aware that the United Nations has guidelines for policing that are available for everyone to see. Yet most North American police officers probably have never read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and probably have never read the United Nations Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement Officials, and probably are unaware of that in Europe there's organizations that are, where you can find the European Partners Against Corruption, and you can download easily from a website their police oversight principles. And what I want you to get, I want you to understand that we have, around the world, we have some issues in common. Next slide, please. So let's talk about complexity. There is no single model of civilian oversight that fits every situation. This is not like a cookbook where you can find a recipe and say, oh, it worked over here, so let's just move that program and move it over there. Because you have to take into account the history of the community where you're working. La historia de la comunidad donde uno está haciendo el trabajo es sumamente importante. Uno tiene que conocer el contexto político y cultural, and you have to understand that for some subsets of the community, there's a historical memory that you need to understand. I'll just give you the example of, in the United States, many minority and African Americans, for example, when they think of the police, they think of an entity to be feared. But if you understand the history of African Americans in the United States, you need to understand that during the period of times of slavery, the people that enforced the laws were the police. The people that enforced the laws during the Jim Crow period after the Civil War, you know, where the North won supposedly, but the South still had very, very discriminatory laws. The people that enforced the laws were the police, and they were enforcing, at times they were enforcing unjust laws. Leyes sin justicia. Okay? And that memory is stuck in people's minds. And we need to address it. We can't ignore it. Every community has its own set of laws. I told you the United States, we have 50 states. So different sets of laws. And we have a federal court system, and we have 50 state court systems. And then we have municipal judges that are involved in jails, because in the United States, at least where I'm from, the local jails are run by the counties, by the local communities. And so there are many, many different levels that we need to understand. And what works in Florida doesn't work in California because of the laws and the power dynamics. Next slide. The title of this slide is Affirmation, because we need, if we're going to supervise the police, we need to not just criticize. We also need to affirm. We need to let our police know the kind of policing that we want. Our community is responsible for telling the police the kind of policing that they want. They are supposed to work for us. La policía está supuesto trabajar para el bien de la comunidad. Y la idea es que todos tenemos que compartir la responsabilidad de seguridad. El ciudadano no debe decir, el crimen es tu problema, policía. Tú lo resuelves y a mí yo te dejo tranquilo. Déjame tranquilo. But that's not, what we need is we need community to assume responsibility for its share. So when I use the term shared security, that's what I mean. I'm talking about a security that is shared among all of us. The other thing that I need to address in affirmation slide is that one of the big problems that we have in the United States as far as civilian oversight of law enforcement is resistance on the part of police to be supervised, on the part of police to be overseen. And that's natural, okay? It's natural. But we need to break down the idea that this us versus them mentality. Us versus them mentality is the enemy of civilian oversight of law enforcement. All of us are citizens, regardless of whether we wear a uniform or not. Okay? The way that I understand that every police, every country comes from different roots. The roots in English-speaking countries comes from England and Great Britain and Sir Robert Peel and the periods of time when he came up with the concepts of modern policing. And those concepts of modern policing include the idea that you that are police officers, you are people that we have chosen for you to help us maintain our security. But you are part of us, okay? And as you know, in England, many of the police officers didn't carry arms, didn't carry weapons. Now you go to the United States, you see everybody carrying weapons, all right? And that's a whole nother story. But it's important for us as we build bridges between community and police that we break down us versus them. Todos somos seres humanos primero. We all have human qualities first. And it's those human qualities that we need to watch ourselves over. Tenemos que tener vigilancia sobre la conducta de seres humanos. Some of us have been granted powers by the community to arrest, to detain, to question. But you police officers, you're still part of the community. And that's part of the future that I see of community and policing, is that there is more and more shared security and less us versus them thinking. Next slide. So our intention is to build, is to create, is to make the ties stronger, not weaker. De mejorar las relaciones entre policía y comunidad, no hacer las relaciones más débiles. ¿Ok? Así que eso es la intención. Tenemos que reconocer que somos trabajando por la misma meta. We're working as partners for the same goal. Now, because of history and because of social situation and context, and every community has its history of corruption and its history of institutional trust. Every community is different. But we need to understand that part of what we desire, part of our intention, is to build the trust in the institution of the police. And that requires professionalizing the police and treating the police like human beings, giving them a decent wage, a decent salary, so they are not as tempted to do corrupt things. And all change requires patience and persistence. But for those of us in civilian oversight law enforcement, this persistence is very, very important. Okay? This is not easy job. This is the job that if you're doing your job right, somebody is criticizing you. Okay? And what we're looking for is improved trust. Now, if you went to Canada and you asked the citizens, if you did a survey about trust of police, you will find that the trust of police is higher in Canada than it is in the United States. Now, ask yourself why. I've already given you a hint. They have civilian oversight of law enforcement bodies at all levels. Now, my understanding is that in Mexico, if you do the same kind of survey, that there are a lot of people that don't trust the police. And we need to work on that. And how do you work on that? Do you just say, oh, police, you get better? No. We have to assume our part of the deal, our responsibility. We have to engage the police, okay, and let the police know that we care about them and that we have something in common. I bet you the police have grandchildren too, okay? And so what we need to look for is a superordinate goal where we all agree that what we're working for is improvement. We're working for improving the trust of the citizen for the police. Why? Because it makes sense that in order to increase public safety, you have to increase cooperation. Okay? If people aren't reporting crime because they don't trust the police, how can you really address public safety? So trust becomes very important. Next slide. So we have to earn the community trust. La policía tiene que ganar la confianza del pueblo. No es algo que lo puede demandar. La tiene que ganar. So one of the things that I would suggest for police officers to do and for community is to ask your community, what kind of policing do you want? Assess the wants of the community. Show the community that you have an accountability mechanism. Demuéstrale a la comunidad que tienes una forma de ajustar las situaciones, de rendir cuentas. But also, if you're involved in this work, you have to accept your humanity. And that means that we have to accept our imperfection. None of us are perfect. And because we have a uniform, that just gives us more power, but it doesn't take away our imperfections. So I do think that it's very, very important for us to start measuring community trust. And, it's not being done well in the United States. I think that you guys in Mexico, with Causas en Común, I think you're doing a pretty good job of your community surveys, and I would encourage you to do more. Every community, in every place where there's police, there ought to be some kind of survey that assesses the trust of the community of that institution. Next slide. Cooperation. We have to understand that partners don't always agree. If I'm going to assume the responsibility of watching what the police do, you have to understand that there are going to be times when you and I are going to see the same event and we're going to have two different interpretations of what happened. Okay? That is human nature. You heard that I was a psychologist, right? Did I say that? Since 1979, my PhD is in psychology. And I practice peace psychology. And one of the things that you learn when you become a psychologist is you learn about self-deception. Okay? And so once you learn about self-deception, then you realize that you can't be 100% accurate all the time. And when you learn about how memory works and how stress influences memory and how uniforms impact how we do our job, all of that becomes very, very important, because the bottom line is people can experience the same event, exact same event, and have two totally different perceptions as to what happened. And they're both right. And so we have to understand that even though we work in a system of laws, laws were created at a time when psychology wasn't born yet. All right? So we're dealing with a way of controlling human behavior that's based on misinformation. One of the weakest forms of evidence that there is eyewitness testimony. And we know that because of the psychological research. And yet it is still such a big part of how we determine who's right and who's wrong. All right. So, what slide am I on? Cooperation. So we want to create a policing that we want. We want to create a constructive way of dealing with conflict. And it's natural for there to be conflict in communities. You can't do away with it. We human beings are so imperfect that we will always have conflict. But we do have the opportunity to work together and to learn from one another and to build community. When I was in charge of the independent review panel, we created a program where we took 20 critics of the police and 20 police lieutenants, and we put them together for 8 weeks of engagement. And you know something? After those 8 weeks, where the citizens had an opportunity to experience what police had to do and what they had to live with, and the stresses involved, that their opinions about the police came up a little bit. And the opinion of the citizens came up a little bit too in the eyes of the police, because it started to break down this us versus them type of thing. And we started to focus on the common humanity that we have. Next slide. The commonality we need to learn from our international experience. I already mentioned the defunct IACOL and the defunct International Network of Independent Oversight of Policing. But you should be aware that that police have similar problems everywhere, and citizens have similar problems. It seems that just about everywhere you go, there are more minorities and poor people in prisons than there are other people. And that seems to be common around the world. And one of the things that we need to do is that we need to increase the sense of justice that people experience. And people aren't going to experience a good sense of justice if they see disparities in outcome that are associated with policing practice. Next slide. Efficiency. Now, In the United States, there are many, many different models of civilian oversight of law enforcement. Some of them have one person, an auditor or model, it could be called. Some of them have 4 or 5 people. Some of them have 20 to 30 people. Some of them have independent panels that are made up of board members of civilians that are volunteers that listen to the production of professional staff. And what I want to say is that the kind of model that's appropriate for Mexico, Mexico needs to decide. The model that's appropriate for each state in Mexico, probably what works in Tamaulipas may not work in Guerrero, and vice versa. Okay? You need to put lots of things together. But one of the biggest problems we have when there's a creation of a new civilian oversight entity is that sometimes it's done simply to satisfy a political expediency, right? And so people hurry up and put something together without listening to what's been done in other places, without paying attention to issues of screening, of selection, of training, of compensation, of the type of investigation that's going to be done, and procedural impediments. So one of the things I want to warn you about is that don't create anything without doing your homework. Don't create something that has no chance in heck of surviving for more than a couple of years. If your civilian oversight of entity is dependent on the outside, it's not going to last. Your civilian oversight of law enforcement entity needs to be created. Well, this is my personal opinion. It's going to be stronger if it's created from the citizens up than coming down from some expert, okay? Because each community is so different. But it's important that if you set something up, that you don't set yourself up for failure by wanting to do too much with too few resources. So that's one of the major mistakes that I see in the United States, where a community wants to create a new way of doing things, and they put something together without doing their homework, and they say, oh, we're going to take care of all citizen complaints, and we'll give you two people to take care of it. That is a recipe for failure, right? So you need to make sure that whatever you create allows for you to get at the most important problems, which means that you have to go through a triage type of process, a screening type of process, where not every complaint is going to get the same amount of attention, right? There are some complaints that are going to have a much larger impact on policy than others. And what are we interested in? We're interested in improving. Okay, so I want to make sure that you understand that when you create a civilian oversight of law enforcement entity, you need to be very, very careful not to overpromise. Okay? The one thing that you can promise is that you can give every citizen an opportunity to be heard. That you can promise. And that's one of the most important gifts that we can give. Because at least you can help somebody document their pain and document their experience and even help them articulate their pain and their experience. That doesn't mean that you can give all your resources to everyone that has pain. You understand, right? I hope you understand. So we need to be efficient and very careful. And what I mentioned by procedural impediment is where you build an organization where you say you're going to thoroughly investigate every complaint at all different levels, and then you find yourself with a big backlog of complaints, and you're not really impacting policy the way you should. Thank you. I notice I haven't been paying attention to my signs. All right, so let's move a little faster. Partnerships, next slide. I think we've already talked about this. Here in Mexico, you're blessed to have Causa en Común, a good civil society group, but I also want to encourage you to tap into your local faith communities. When I say faith community, I mean iglesias, churches, okay? And, you know, they can be part of the solution. We need to encourage more engagement workshops, and the churches can be of help. Next slide. We need to practice being genuine, real, okay? We need to be honest and respectful. We need to have good relationships. This work is all about relationships. We already said we don't have to agree with each other all the time, but we should have a common goal, and we should keep on refocusing on that common goal, which is a safer community where we share security. I already talked about situational variables, and that everybody has a different lens from which they see things. We need to respect those different lenses. That comes from experience. If I had more time, I'd go into, you know, how the brain works and how stress influences perception and memory. And we could spend days talking about that. And you would come out of here saying, oh my gosh, you know, life is a little bit more complicated than I thought it was. We create our reality. Our memories are like Swiss cheese, you know, the cheese that has the holes in it. When we capture the information, we put in Swiss cheese. When we take out the recall, we fill in the holes. And we fill in the holes with our prejudices and our prior experiences. Next slide. Change. We need to learn from injustice and error. We need to learn from injustice and error. We're all going to make errors, and injustice seems like it's going to be around for a while. All right? And so we should take every opportunity to mine every problem so that we can figure out how to grow from it and how to become better. Next slide, please. We need to measure success for what's the greater good of the community. We need to get this away from the idea of evaluating police officers by determining how many people they arrest. Okay, that's not what shared security is about. Next slide. Let's see. Are we going backwards? Yeah, we're going backwards. Vamos a seguir para adelante. Next slide para adelante. Assessment, sigue para adelante. Confidentiality, ahí. Ok. La confianza es difícil para ganar, pero fácil de perder. Okay? So understand that we're into this for the long haul, not short term. We need to be transparent, but at the same time respect the confidentiality of people that are providing information that if you disclose who they are, they may not live for a long period of time. All right? So we also need to engage in quiet diplomacy. There are some things that are best not said, because what we need to continue to build on is relationships. Okay? If I did an investigation and I found 40 different things wrong, okay, I'm still going to focus on the 2 or 3 things that have the greatest impact on policy. Next slide, please. Okay, we need to focus on accountability and not on blame. And we need to understand that the family dynamics. You know, when I worked for Miami-Dade County, I used to run the crime prevention programs for Miami-Dade County, and some of the crime prevention programs dealt with family violence. And you know, we discovered how difficult it is for family members to turn into the police members of the family that were committing child abuse. Very, very, very difficult for a family to turn in a family member. Think of those same dynamics in a police department, okay? It's very, very, very difficult for one to turn in a member of their family. And police officers sometimes develop this sense of family. They're there to protect each other's back. Okay, so next slide, creativity. And, you know, I'm obviously going to run out of time, so I want to make sure that you understand that all these slides are available to you, and I'm available to you by email. The last slide is going to have my contact information, and I want you to make sure that you take down my email and you ask me whatever question that you have. Question. Should we stop here and open up for questions? Okay, so the last, my contact information is in the last slide. We'll get you a copy of the last slide. My email is avpmiami@aol.com. Perdón que el tiempo se me ha escapado. So, estamos ahora abiertos a preguntas. Aquí sí voy a hablar totalmente en español, o vamos a decir en cubano callejero. Así que, ¿quién tiene alguna pregunta? A ver, dígame.
Abriremos el espacio para un par de preguntas y continuar con la agenda. Gracias, Eduardo.
¿Qué debe hacer el policía para soportar esa transición, ese cambio? Porque tal parece que aquí en México nunca es suficiente el esfuerzo que hace el policía. Y los policías nos esforzamos por hacer que la gente confíe en nosotros, pero 1000 acciones buenas se opacan con una mala de policías, que no es nuestra culpa que el Centro de Control de Confianza los haya aceptado, que hayan pasado ese filtro. Sí. Los policías no estamos en contra de las evaluaciones, sino que se hagan acordes con lo que la sociedad mexicana exige. ¿Qué debe hacer el policía para soportar esa transición? Porque diario aparecen insultos nuevos para la policía, diario se aprende la gente groserías nuevas contra nosotros. ¿Qué podemos hacer para soportar esa transición?
Es muy buena pregunta, y yo le puedo decir que lo que sugiero es que el policía haga lo que tenga que hacer para mantener su respeto propio. Si el policía hace the next right thing, su conducta está basada en hacer lo correcto, ¿okay? Obviamente, sobre tiempo, la comunidad se va a dar cuenta que ese policía se respeta, porque ese policía tiene en su conciencia que siempre va a hacer lo correcto. No es fácil, especialmente cuando hay tantos estreses y otra vez el policía en México no es tan bien pagado como debe ser, pero el enfoque mío es que un enfoque interior, que si uno actúa de una forma donde uno puede acostarse esa noche y decir yo funcioné como una persona de honor, ¿okay? Responsable, y hice lo correcto. Ese es el consejo principal que yo le puedo dar al policía, y que tenga paciencia y esperanza y persistencia, porque si hay movimiento, el policía se está considerando un poquito más ahora que antes, todavía falta mucho más. Otra pregunta. Señor.
Buenos días, gracias. Mi nombre es Carlos Cruz Sandoval, servidor. Yo vengo del Colegio Nacional de Profesionistas en Administración Policial, también soy policía del Distrito Federal. Aquí la pregunta sería, ¿cómo podríamos o cuál sería una estrategia a seguir para superar un evento que se quedó en la memoria de todos los mexicanos? 2 de octubre, donde las instituciones de seguridad hicieron algo que no, para lo cual no fueron creadas. Hablaba usted obviamente de esta fase de la memoria, esta historia que marca el suceso, y tal vez preguntándole incluso como psicólogo, ¿cuál es una estrategia adecuada por la cual podamos superar esta situación a manera de que entonces, ahora sí, ciudadanos, reconozcamos el trabajo del policía para beneficio de nosotros? Entonces sería mi pregunta.
Yeah. Bueno, primero, la historia no se puede ignorar. Y también no se puede corregir los problemas de un día al otro. Así que una respuesta por parte de la comunidad es aumentar la vigilancia a los policías que quedan, pero en forma respetuosa, dándole el balance de no solamente criticarlos, sino de también darle su bendición, su buena reconocimiento. Lo que tenemos que evitar es alguien que asume que puede corregir el problema y va a tomar el mando y va a asegurar que estos problemas no van a existir en el futuro, porque eso desvía de lo que se necesita. Lo que se necesita es, de mi punto de vista, es que trabajemos en conjunto, no siempre de acuerdo, pero reconociendo lo bueno y criticando con respeto a lo que necesita cambiar. Lo primero que yo hiciera, si yo fuera en esa comunidad, es asegurar que los que tienen autoridad reconozcan qué tipo de trabajo policíaco desea la comunidad. ¿Okay? ¿Qué tipo de policía yo quiero tener? ¿Okay? Y si porque la policía, de mi punto de vista, otra vez, trabajamos todos para la comunidad. El policía es lo que le hemos dado poderes que no mantenemos todos, ¿no? No sé si eso llegó a dar una respuesta, pero es lo que tengo por ahora. ¿Alguien más? Aquí atrás, señor. Sí, con el sombrero. Ahora.
De los recuerdos de mi niñez, me vienen a la mente 3 tipos de policía.
Ajá.
El policía preventivo, el servicio secreto y el policía judicial. El policía preventivo.
Gracias. Es el policía de barrio, el policía comunitario.
Ya.
Un personaje querido y apreciado por toda la comunidad. Todos le conocían, normalmente era vecino. Todo mundo le invitaba a un café o un taco, sin que esto quisiera decir corrupción. Se lo ofrecían de buena manera, se lo ofrecían con cariño, con afecto. Saludaba a todos, los conocía a todos. Y esto daba una gran seguridad a esa comunidad. No quiero hablar del servicio secreto y de la policía judicial, hay muchas historias negras que yo quiero hacer a un lado en esta ocasión. Y voy a centrar mi comentario en este policía preventivo de barrio. No sé si usted concuerde conmigo que la solución para esta policía de proximidad que se pretende sea volver a esa época, explotar esa valiosísima memoria histórica de la comunidad cuando el policía era uno de ellos. cuando el policía se integraba a la comunidad y de esta manera le daba seguridad a todo mundo. Su presencia inhibía de cualquier acto fuera de la ley. ¿Por qué? Porque nos conocía.
Yeah.
Y no queríamos que nos fuera a difamar ante toda la comunidad que nosotros robamos, defraudamos o cualquier otra cosa. Sí, yo tengo esa idea, que tal vez volviendo a esos tiempos, con esa figura, reforzándola, se puede aumentar la seguridad. No sé usted qué opina.
Bueno, buena observación. Lo que yo no quiero repetir la historia. Yo quiero un futuro, ¿no? Entonces yo quiero, de la historia, yo quiero llevarme lo mejor y dejar atrás lo peor, ¿no? Entonces yo no quiero volver a tiempos antiguos, a donde, por ejemplo, estoy hablando de los Estados Unidos, a donde el perfil racial era mucho más prevalente que se encuentra hoy en día. Yo no quiero regresar a eso, pero sí pienso que el policía que es conocido por la comunidad es respetado más que un policía que cae como paracaídas cuando alguien reporta un crimen. Así que en ese sentido quiero llevar de ese pasado, de ese policía comunitario, eso sí lo quiero llevar, pues no quiero llevar lo negativo, ¿ok? A donde el prejuicio y el racismo eran más prevalentes que hoy en día. Hoy siguen prevalentes en los Estados Unidos, pero hay movimiento. Y otra vez, el interés mío es un futuro incrementamos la seguridad compartida, shared security. Pero muy buena, ya. Yeah. Por acá había otro, yes.
Mi nombre es Felipe Álvarez Mendoza, venimos representando a lo que es la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México, la licenciatura en Seguridad Ciudadana, soy licenciado en Seguridad Ciudadana. También hablarles que estamos en proceso de formación del Colegio de Licenciados en Seguridad Ciudadana y Gobernanza para trabajar sobre temas en común. Mi pregunta sería, ¿qué subsistema dentro del sistema americano es el que respalda más las acciones ciudadanas?
¿Cuál es el sistema en Norteamérica que respalda?
Sí, que le da más respaldo. Hablando de sumar causas.
Ya. Bueno, yo creo que, mira, para ser completamente honesto contigo, lo que se encuentra en los Estados Unidos depende en la actitud de la comandancia de la policía. Hay jefes de policía muy progresistas y jefes de policías que no son tan progresistas, que están enfocados en lo blanco y negro y que esto es la ley y esto no es la ley, y que no están involucrados tanto en ayudar a la comunidad a resolver problemas, y que de mi punto de vista actualmente ellos son un problema porque no están enfocados en resolver problemas. No sé si me entienden. Okay. Entonces, tú mencionas instituciones. Ahora, yo creo que la institución tenemos instituciones que ya existen que se pueden utilizar mejor. ¿Okay? La enseñanza de los policías, las supuestas academias de policías. Tengo que respirar un poquito porque lo que enseñan es importante, pero no lo suficiente. ¿Okay? Entonces, si uno es policía ya y uno va a la academia y llega a la calle, casi siempre lo primero que lo dicen sus colegas es: oye, olvídate de todo lo que te dijeron en la academia. ¿Okay? Así que existe la institución, pero hay algo que falla en la traducción de lo que se enseñó y de lo que se practica, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, ¿Por qué entonces no enfocarnos en la práctica? ¿Ok? Y cambiar nuestros sistemas de pensamientos de qué es lo que es entrenamiento. Eso, de mi punto de vista, vaya, ¿cuántas horas más tenemos? Okay. Pero es sumamente importante, porque necesitamos que aumentar la práctica de conducta apropiada. Okay. Y eso requiere un tipo de aprendizaje, experimental learning, es aprendizaje haciendo el trabajo, pero con personas que son respetables. Okay. ¿Tengo más? ¿Se acabó?
Ya tenemos que continuar.
Bueno,
pues
perdón.
les pido un aplauso para Eduardo. Muchas gracias, Eduardo, por compartir esta experiencia. Recibe un reconocimiento a nombre de Causa en Común. Muchas gracias. Pues qué importante estas reflexiones y la experiencia traída por Eduardo, que seguramente, si bien no todos los modelos se pueden copiar, sí podemos tomar bases de experiencias y buenas prácticas en otras latitudes. Muchas gracias.